Chapter 1. The Last Crypt Keeper. The ruins of Castle Sternholme stood like a broken fang against the blood-red sky of Sylvania. Time had gnawed at its once mighty walls, leaving little more than a hollow skeleton of crumbling stone and shattered towers. Beneath its bones, buried deep within the black earth, lay something far older than the empire itself, a secret so terrible that even the dead whispered in fear. Ulrich von Kessel stood before the sealed iron door of the crypt, the cold breath of the grave curling around his boots. He traced his fingers over the sigils of warding carved into the archway, each symbol etched by his ancestors to keep prying eyes, and worse, at bay. The duty of the von Kessels had passed from father to son for centuries, an unbroken lineage of crypt keepers bound to watch over the slumbering master. But Ulrich was the last. He lit a candle, its frail light barely holding back the shadows. The great tomb yawned open before him, a cathedral of stone carved into the earth itself. Rows of nameless sarcophagi lined the chamber, filled with the husks of those who had served before him, centuries of crypt keepers, entombed with their oaths. At the very heart of the chamber lay the black sarcophagus, bound in heavy chains and inscribed with blasphemous script. This was the resting place of King Dragos the Pale, once a mighty Strigoi lord, now little more than a myth whispered by the desperate and the damned. Ulrich exhaled, his breath misting in the frigid air. What am I doing here? He had asked himself this question 1,000 times. He had been born into this duty, raised on stories of his family's legacy, trained since childhood to tend the crypt, guard its secrets, and await the day when their master would rise once more. His father had died upholding this oath, his grandfather before him. But Ulrich, he was alone. No brothers, no heirs, just an aging crypt keeper clinging to a past that no longer had meaning. He stepped closer to the sarcophagus, staring at the ancient metalwork, the once gilded relief of Dragos now tarnished with age. The stories spoke of the king's monstrous hunger, his exile, his fall at the hands of his own kin. The Strigoi had been outcast, hunted like vermin, their once noble houses turned to ruin. Dragos, the greatest of their kind, had been betrayed and entombed beneath the castle by those who feared his return. Ulrich placed a hand upon the stone, feeling the unnatural chill seeping into his skin. And then, for the first time in his life, the crypt spoke back. A whisper, low and guttural, slithered into his mind, words in a tongue he did not know, yet understood perfectly. The candle in his hand flickered violently, the shadows along the walls writhing like something unseen stirred within them. The whisper became a rasp, a voice scraping against the edge of his thoughts, a voice from the abyss. You have waited too long, my faithful warden. Ulrich staggered back, his pulse hammering. His mouth felt dry, his limbs heavy. The crypt seemed suddenly smaller, darker, as if the very air pressed in around him. Who's there? He gasped. The shadows coiled, and for a fleeting moment Ulrich saw something move. A figure, not flesh, not bone, but a terrible specter of hunger and ruin. Its eyes burned like dying embers, and its voice was a grave, unsealed. Blood calls to blood, Ulrich von Kessel. My time draws near. The candle snuffed out. Darkness swallowed the crypt. Ulrich stood frozen, his heart pounding like a war drum in the silence. For centuries, his family had guarded this tomb, sworn to protect it from those who sought to free the monster within. But as the last von Kessel, standing alone in the blackness, he was no longer sure which side he was meant to serve. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The night sky over Sylvania churned like a cauldron of ink and blood, the heavens torn apart by an unnatural storm. Forks of purple lightning split the darkness, illuminating the desolation below, a battlefield soaked in gore, where the dead did not rest, and the living had long since fled. At the heart of this ruin stood King Dragos the Pale, his gaunt form draped in the tattered regalia of a monarch long unrecognized. His skeletal fingers, tipped with blackened claws, clutched a great iron-forged spear, its blade dripping with the blood of traitors. His once proud court lay in pieces around him, his most loyal thralls torn apart by their own kind. Above him, perched upon the broken battlements of a ruined keep, his betrayer laughed. Vladik the Crimson, a rival Strigoi, his massive form more beast than man, loomed against the stormlit sky. His fanged maw curled in a grin as he watched the king falter. "Did you truly believe they would still follow you, Dragos?" Vladik sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "You clung to the corpse of your kingdom for too long. The age of kings is over. The age of beasts has begun." Dragos, bleeding from a dozen wounds, did not kneel. His eyes, once dark pits of hunger, burned with hatred that defied death itself. "You are a dog," Dragos spat, his voice still regal despite his ruin, sniffing at the scraps of true power. "I will see you gutted for this." Vladik only chuckled, descending from the ruins with unnatural grace. Around them, more Strigoi gathered, lesser vampires who had once called Dragos their lord. Now they stood against him, having pledged their fealty to Vladik's savage rule. But they were not alone. Beyond the undead, in the mists at the edges of the battlefield, mortal witch hunters and necromancers loomed, servants of Sigmar and Nagash alike, who had sworn that Dragos would never rise to power again. "You see, my king," Vladik mused, stepping forward, "even the living fear what you are. They stand with me because they know the truth." He raised a black iron blade, ancient and terrible, forged in the dark fires of the underworld. "Your time is done." Dragos roared and lunged, but the blade struck true. A monstrous wail split the night as iron met undead flesh, carving through his heart with the power of a dozen betrayals. The world twisted, the storm raging above screaming as Dragos fell. The great king, the last noble Strigoi, crashed to the ground, his body twisting into a grotesque half-corpse, half-shadow, bound in agony. Vladik watched with cold satisfaction as the mortals stepped forward. Priests of Mar began their chants, necromancers weaved their spells, and Sigmarite warriors drove their warhammers into the earth. They would not destroy him, no, they feared what he might become if slain outright. Instead, they would seal him away. And so, beneath the ruins of Castle Sternholme, Dragos the Pale was entombed alive, bound in iron chains and ancient spells, left to rot in the blackness forever. The birth of the Crypt Keepers. From the mist of memory another voice rose, one that Ulrich knew well. Ulrich von Kessel, the first of the Crypt Keepers, knelt before the blood-stained altar, his hands trembling as the sorcerers carved the oath into his very soul. "Your family will be the keepers of this grave," intoned the high priest of Mor, his hooded form silhouetted by candlelight. "None may disturb this place, none may know the truth." Gregor nodded, his face carved from stone. "And if he wakes?" he asked, voice hollow. The priest did not hesitate. "Then the dead shall rise in numbers untold, and the world will burn." Gregor cast his gaze toward the sealed crypt, where Dragos the Pale now slumbered, his body frozen in a deathless curse. "Even now," he swore, the king whispered to him from the darkness. And so the von Kessel oath was forged in blood and silence. For centuries, they would watch the tomb, guard the secret, and ensure that no foolish soul ever tried to wake the dead. Ulrich gasped awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. The crypt was silent once more, but the echoes of the past still lingered in the cold air. For the first time in his life he knew the truth. and he was no longer certain that he was meant to keep Dragos buried. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The village of Hasseldorf lay on the fringes of Sylvania, a place of quiet despair where the sun seldom shone and the mist clung to the rooftops like a funeral shroud. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their voices wary of the night, and doors remained bolted long before dusk fell. Superstition, they called it. Fear of the dark. But tonight the fear was not of what lurked beyond the tree line, but of the men who had ridden into town. The mercenaries came first, their armor dull, their weapons worn from long years of bloodshed. They were not men of honor, nor of faith. They were killers for hire, their loyalties as fleeting as the coin that fed them. But behind them, on horseback, clad in the heavy black leathers of a Templar of Sigmar, rode a man who brought true fear. Witch-hunter Captain Armand Falk. His long coat was lined with silver stakes, and his belt bore flasks of sanctified oil. A great broadsword, its pommel marked with a sunburst, hung from his hip, but it was the cold steel of his gaze that struck fear into the hearts of those who met it. He did not ride fast, nor did he need to. The villagers shrank away from him, unwilling to meet the eyes of a man who saw corruption in all things. 12 dead in Waldenhof, their hearts ripped from their chests. Falk's voice was measured, devoid of emotion. One of his men, Sergeant Luthar, spat on the ground. "Wolves, Captain, or bandits." Falk did not look at him. His gaze swept the village, lingering on the faces of the frightened townsfolk. No. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the frozen dirt. This is something older. The villagers did not need to be told why the Templar was here. Rumors had spread like a sickness, whispers of a hidden crypt, of a stirring within the grave, of something beneath the ruins of Castle Sternholme. For years no one had dared go near the accursed ruins, but now the stories had changed. Lights had been seen within the keep, figures moving through the darkness where none should tread. A foul wind carried whispers from the hills, and in the dead of night the ground itself seemed to breathe. Something unnatural was waking. Falk turned to his men. "Find the elder. Bring him to me." The mercenaries moved without hesitation, shoving past frightened villagers as they searched for the man in question. In the shadows of the crypt. Far from Hasseldorf, beneath the ruined halls of Sternholme, Ulrich von Kessel stood before the sarcophagus of King Dragos the Pale, his mind heavy with the weight of what he had seen. The visions had not faded, the voices had not ceased. The past was stirring, and now the living were drawing near. He could hear them, beyond the crypt, beyond the ruins, scavengers and thieves, poking through the bones of history, not just mercenaries, not just witch-hunters, but others. Necromancers. From deep within the fog-laden forests they had come, servants of Nagash, drawn to the whispers in the night. They sought the power hidden within this place, the remnants of a long-dead king whose name still carried weight in the underworld. Ulrich's hands tightened into fists. "I know." He turned his gaze back to the iron-bound sarcophagus, staring at the rusted sigils meant to keep its prisoner in slumber. And in the silence, he swore he heard a breath, a slow, ragged inhalation, as though something within the sarcophagus was beginning to wake. Blood in the snow. Back in Hasseldorf, the village elder was dragged into the town square. A frail man, his back bent with age, he trembled as Falk approached. "Please, Lord Templar, I know nothing." Falk crouched, gripping the elder's jaw in a vice-like grip, forcing him to look into his pitiless eyes. "A lie?" His voice was calm, cold. "You all know. You always know." The mercenaries had begun searching homes, tearing through belongings, looking for any sign of corruption. And then, a scream. Falk turned sharply as one of his men was hurled from a doorway, his body crushed as though by an invisible force. A figure emerged from the house. Not a man. Nothing. It stood tall, cloaked in filth, its skin pale as a corpse, its limbs too long and too thin, its clawed fingers dripping with fresh blood. A Strigoi ghoulkin, a servant of the old vampires. The villager screamed as the beast lunged forward, its fangs bared. Falk did not move. His hand dropped to his belt, pulling free a silver stake. By it, a torch lit the sky, and the mercenaries attacked. The streets of Hasseldorf ran red with blood, and the storm began to break. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Key. The torches in the crypt burned low, their weak flames barely pushing back the shadows. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old death, the silence so absolute that even Ulrich's own breath seemed intrusive. The voices had not spoken again, but their presence lingered, a pressure at the edges of his mind, a whisper just beyond his hearing. Ulrich moved carefully through the vaulted stone chamber, his fingers tracing the edges of forgotten relics and the remains of his ancestors. He had spent his entire life tending this place, but tonight it felt different. Tonight something was watching. He stepped toward the great sarcophagus of Dragos the Pale, its iron bindings dull with age, yet still thrumming with the presence of ancient power. His father had always warned him never to touch the chains, never to disturb the inscriptions. But his father was dead now, and the past was speaking to him in ways he no longer understood. His gaze fell lower to the base of the sarcophagus, where the dust had been disturbed. Someone had been here before. His pulse quickened. The crypt had only ever belonged to the von Kessels. If another had set foot within these halls, it could mean only one thing. His ancestors had lied. He crouched down, brushing away the dust and decay with careful fingers. Beneath the grime of centuries, he found a gap in the stone, a small recess beneath the coffin's foundation. He reached inside, his fingers scraping against something cold, something unnatural. His hand closed around iron. Ulrich pulled it free, his breath catching in his throat. It was a key, a long black iron key, its surface worn smooth, its edges etched with arcane runes that seemed to shift when he stared at them too long. The prophecy of the Pale King. His father had spoken of a hidden truth, whispered only once, upon his deathbed. The dead whisper, only blood will answer. Ulrich had never known what those words meant. He had assumed they were the ravings of a dying man, the last fading thoughts of one who had spent too long in the presence of the grave. But now, as he turned the black key over in his hands, he felt it. A pulse, like a heartbeat, but slower, deeper. A memory stirred. As a child, he had once crept into the crypt, eager to see what his father kept hidden. He had pressed himself against the cold sarcophagus, tracing the shapes of the old runes, and in that moment he had heard something. A whisper. Not words, not yet. Just a voice. His father had dragged him away, panic in his eyes, shaking him by the shoulders. Never listen to the voices, he had warned. If they call to you, boy, you must turn away. But Ulrich had not turned away. Not then, and not now. The buried truth. The key was not just a key. It was a promise, a prophecy of things to come. Ulrich could feel it in his bones. This was meant to be found, meant to be used. Somewhere within the crypt, a lock awaited. Somewhere within the darkness, a door must open. And in the silence of the tomb, as Ulrich held the key tight in his grip, he heard the whisper once more. Blood will answer, Ulrich von Kessel. The candle beside him flickered, its flame dying in an unseen breath of wind. And in the suffocating dark, something shifted inside the sarcophagus. Chapter 5. The Hunters Close In. The fires in Hasseldorf's village square had burned long into the night. The bodies of the slain Ghoulkin and those villagers accused of harboring darkness lay in a charred, smoking pyre, their ashes carried away by the cold Sylvanian wind. Captain Armand Falk watched the embers smolder, his expression unreadable. The stench of burned flesh and sanctified oil clung to his coat, but he paid it no mind. The guilty burned, as they always had, as they always would. He had been sent here by the Grand Templars of Aldorf, tasked with rooting out the rising corruption in Sylvania before it could spread. This was not the first den of heresy he had purged, nor would it be the last. But something about this village troubled him. It was not the ghoul that had lunged from the shadows. It was not the mercenaries who whispered nervously behind his back. It was the things left unsaid. Falk's eyes swept across the remaining villagers, their faces hollow with fear, their lips pressed tight. They had lived beneath the shadow of Castle Sternholme for generations, yet none had spoken of it, not when his men asked about the ruins, not when they pressed for names. The crypt, the hidden place beneath the ruined castle, was a secret held in blood. And Falk had seen enough of the world to know secrets were always paid for in suffering. The name of the crypt keeper. "Sir, we've learned a name." Falk turned as Sergeant Luthar approached, his face dark with suspicion. The man was a veteran of the Templars' war against the Drakenhof Covens, one of Falk's most trusted men, Ulrich von Kessel. Falk's brow arched slightly. Von Kessel. The name was old, older than the Empire's reach into Sylvania. He lies alone at the edge of the ruins, doesn't come to the village, doesn't trade, doesn't speak much to anyone. The locals say his family has always lived there, though no one remembers why. And they never questioned it, Falk asked, his voice as cold as the grave. Luthar shrugged, adjusting the grip on his warhammer. Sylvanians don't question things that don't ask questions of them. He's the last of his line, though. The others? Dead, vanished, no graves. No graves. Falk's lips curled slightly. That meant one of two things. Either they had been taken by something in the night, or they had never truly died at all. And this von Kessel, what does he do? Luthar hesitated. The alive say he keeps the dead. The words settled heavily in the space between them. Falk's fingers curled over the grip of his sword, the cold leather pressing against his palm. And he will answer for it. Whispers in the dark. The wind carried voices through Hasseldorf's twisting alleys, hushed tones spoken in fear. The hunters will go for him next. They say he's a sorcerer, keeping things locked in the crypt. No man lives alone by the ruins and comes back whole. Ulrich heard it all. From the shadows beyond the village, he watched as torches gathered in the square, as witch hunters and mercenaries sharpened blades, loaded pistols, and made their plans. He had been a fool to think they would not come. He had been a fool to believe he could hold this secret alone. Beneath his coat, his fingers traced the shape of the black iron key, its presence against his chest as heavy as the weight in his mind. His father's final words returned to him, unbidden. When the dead whisper, only blood will answer. Ulrich swallowed, because tonight he knew the whispers would soon be screams. Chapter 6. Blood and Betrayal. The first knife in the back is never the one that kills. Ulrich had always known this, had learned it from whispers in the dark, from the way the old stories were told in hushed tones. Betrayal never came from an enemy. It came from someone you once called brother. And yet, as he knelt in the mud, his arms wrenched behind his back by rough hands, he realized, knowing had never prepared him for feeling it. Tell them, Ulrich. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Thomas Reichland. Once they had been boys together. Once they had run through the fields beyond Hasseldorf, chasing dreams of leaving Sylvania behind, escaping the shroud of death that lay over this land. But that had been before Ulrich inherited the crypt, before the whispers, before the weight of a dead king's will had settled upon him. Tomas had changed too. He was older, harder, his hands scarred from work, from struggle, from the desperate hunger to survive in a world that did not favor the weak. And now he held the knife. The mercenaries dragged Ulrich into the village square, throwing him to the cold ground before Captain Armand Falk. The witch-hunter stood like an executioner, his broad sword resting against the dirt, his gaze as pitiless as the stones beneath their feet. "This one's a liar, Captain," Tomas said, voice bitter. "He's been hiding something beneath that ruin since the day he could walk." Falk's expression didn't change. His gloved hand gripped Ulrich's hair, forcing his gaze upward. "Is that so?" Falk's voice was calm, but there was no kindness in it. "Tell me, von Kessel, what secrets does your dead house keep?" Ulrich clenched his jaw, the taste of blood thick on his tongue. "You would know more of secrets than I, witch-hunter." The blow came fast, a brutal strike across the face from a steel-clad gauntlet. Ulrich tasted iron as he hit the ground, his head swimming. Falk sighed. "Lies waste my time." Tomas shifted uncomfortably. Just search his home. I know there's something there. I've seen him go out to the ruins at night, seen him slip away when he thought no one was watching. Whatever he's hiding, it's in that house." Ulrich turned his head toward his childhood friend. "You gave me up for a handful of silver." His voice was hoarse. "I would have done the same for you once." Tomas swallowed hard. "I know. And that was the worst of it. The search. They tore through his home like beasts, overturning tables, bookshelves, tearing up floorboards, looking for any sign of the truth he carried." The von Kessel house had never been much, a crumbling remnant of an older time, a place of duty rather than comfort. His father had lived here, his grandfather before him, both tending the crypt, waiting for the day their line would end. Ulrich sat, bound to a chair, watching as the mercenaries destroyed the last remnants of his family's legacy. He remained silent as they ripped through cabinets, as they broke open chests, as they shoved aside furniture. And yet, for all their effort, they found nothing, because the entrance to the crypt was not here. His father had been too clever, had hidden it where no simple men would think to look. Not in the house, not in the ruins, but somewhere elsewhere, somewhere only a von Kessel could reach. Captain Falk's patience was growing thin. He loomed over Ulrich, his expression that of a man who had strangled heresy in its crib more times than he could count. "Last chance." His voice was as cold as the grave. "Where is it?" Ulrich lifted his chin, and he laughed. It was not brave laughter. It was not defiant laughter. It was the laughter of a man who knew something his captor did not. Falk's eyes narrowed. "You'll burn for this." Ulrich smiled, despite the blood staining his teeth. "Then you should have brought more fire. Because even now, even as they held him here, something was waking in the crypt below. And when it rose, there would not be enough fire in the Empire to stop it." Chapter 7. The Curse Awakens. The torches flickered low within the depths of the crypt, casting long, writhing shadows along the cold stone walls. Ulrich von Kessel stumbled forward, his hands still bound, his face slick with sweat and blood. The mercenaries had dragged him to the ruins of Castle Sternholme, hoping to find an entrance to the hidden tomb. They had failed, but Ulrich knew where to go. He had freed himself in the confusion, slipping into the depths of the catacombs while the mercenaries raged above. Now he stood before the sarcophagus of Dragos the Pale, its black iron surface humming with something unseen, something old, something hungry. His father's words echoed in his skull. Where the dead whisper, only blood will answer. Ulrich's breath came fast and shallow. He was wounded, his body beaten from the interrogation, his mind burning with the memories of Tomas's betrayal. His hands were trembling as he braced himself against the stone lid of the sarcophagus, trying to push himself upright. Then it happened. The sting of pain barely registered before a single drop of blood fell from his split knuckles, striking the surface of the sarcophagus. For a moment there was nothing. Then the crypt exhaled. The torches snuffed out, leaving only shifting darkness. The walls shuddered, dust falling from the ceiling in thin rivulets as a deep, resonant groan echoed through the chamber. Ulrich froze, his heart hammering. Beneath his fingers, the chains around the sarcophagus rattled, as if something within had stirred. Then came the whisper. Not from his own mind, not from memory, but from inside the coffin itself. "It has been too long." Ulrich reeled back, his breath hitching. The shadows coiled and twisted, moving like living things, stretching unnaturally along the stone floor. A deep, rasping inhale filled the chamber, the sound of something pulling breath into dead lungs for the first time in centuries. The sarcophagus shifted. A sound like cracking bone filled the crypt as the iron lid shuddered against its restraints. The runes, once so potent, flickered with fading power, their glow dimming as if struggling to contain what lay within. Ulrich knew. He had broken the seal, and now the dead were waking. The whisper came again, closer this time, slithering into his mind like a clawed hand upon his skull. "Blood calls to blood, and you have answered." A hand, withered, blackened, its talons sharp as daggers, pressed against the inside of the sarcophagus. The chains snapped. Ulrich took a staggering step back as the crypt trembled around him, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had spent his whole life guarding this tomb. Now it would not remain sealed much longer. Chapter 8. A Pact of Shadows. The crypt pulsed with unnatural life, a slow and rhythmic throbbing in the air, like a heartbeat long stilled but never truly dead. The darkness had weight now, thick and suffocating, shifting like ink poured into water. Ulrich staggered back, his breath ragged, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body would not obey. Something unseen held him in place. The black iron sarcophagus groaned as its chains fell away, links shattering upon the stone floor. Wisps of black mist coiled from the narrow opening in its lid, spreading like skeletal fingers reaching outward. And then the voice returned. "You have done well, my warden." Ulrich clenched his teeth, trying to fight the cold that curled around his spine. The voice did not belong to a man. It was older, weightier, thick with a malice too vast to fully comprehend. It spoke not in words, but in thoughts woven from shadow and hunger. "Do not fear, my faithful one. You have spilled your blood upon my tomb. You have awakened what was buried. Now you must decide." A shape took form in the mist, a figure not fully flesh, not fully spirit, wreathed in smoke and decay. King Dragos the Pale. Ulrich had heard the legends, the whispers of the last true Strigoi king, betrayed by his own kind, sealed away by enemies both mortal and immortal. But this was not the wretched, monstrous creature the stories had described. Not yet. The shade of Dragos stood tall, his form gaunt and regal, his tattered robes woven with the remnants of past glory. His face was long and angular, his hollow eyes burning with a deep red light, like dying embers waiting for breath to make them blaze anew. And though his body seemed insubstantial, the force of his presence was overwhelming. Ulrich swallowed. He could barely force his words out. "Ling? Why? What do you want from me?" Dragos tilted his head slightly, studying him, the way a wolf studies a wounded thing not worth devouring yet. "I would have your loyalty, Ulrich von Kessel, as your father's father swore before you." The words struck deep. Loyalty, duty. It was what his family had always spoken of. It was why they had died, nameless and forgotten, why they had sacrificed everything to ensure Dragos remained entombed. But was that their true duty? Had they been watchmen? or servants? Ulrich shook his head, trying to clear the haze of thoughts that clawed at the edges of his mind. My family was sworn to keep you from rising. His voice was hoarse, his conviction trembling beneath the weight of what stood before him. Dragos exhaled a sound that might have once been a chuckle, but now carried only the hollow rattle of something long dead. And yet here you are, unlocking my chains. Ulrich felt his stomach tighten. The black iron key burned against his skin, heavy in his coat pocket. He had done this. You have always belonged to me, von Kessel, Dragos continued, stepping closer. Though his form still flickered between corporeal and spectral, his voice was solid as stone. You have spilled your blood upon my tomb. You have already chosen, whether you admit it or not. Ulrich's hands curled into fists. It did not choose. Dragos leaned forward, his burning eyes narrowing. Then choose now. The crypt shook. The shadows tightened around Ulrich, pressing against him, testing him. And then Dragos extended his hand. Long fingers, not yet fully restored, still wreathed in mist, reaching toward him with a silent promise. Kneel, von Kessel. Take the power you need. Become what you were always meant to be. The air was thick with magic, an ancient force pressing down on Ulrich's very soul. And he knew if he took that hand, there would be no turning back. The crypt waited. Dragos waited. And Ulrich, caught between duty and damnation, between fear and fate, hesitated. Chapter 9. The Undead Stir. The crypt pulsed with necromantic energy, thick and cloying as mist, pressing against the ancient stone walls like a tide waiting to break free. The spectral form of King Dragos the Pale still loomed over Ulrich, his outstretched hand hovering between them, waiting for an answer. But Ulrich did not take it. Not yet. Something else was happening. The air shifted, as though the very tomb itself was exhaling, breathing death into the world beyond. And outside, in the darkened fields surrounding Hasseldorf, the dead began to wake, the first to rise. The cemetery on the village outskirts had long been neglected, its rotting wooden fence doing little to keep out the creeping mists of Sylvania. Rows of forgotten graves stood beneath the skeletal trees, markers of men and women who had died nameless, their bodies buried in shallow earth, never truly at rest. Tonight, the ground moved. A single hand, blackened, clawed, wretched with decay, broke through the dirt. Then another, and another. All at once the cemetery shuddered, the quiet of the night breaking with the sound of splitting wood and shifting earth. Coffins splintered, their rotting lids thrust open by bony fingers as the corpses within dragged themselves upright. Some were little more than skeletons, their brittle joints barely holding together as they lurched forward. Others were recently buried, their eyes hollow, their mouths frozen in eternal agony, the last echoes of their mortal pain twisted into undeath. Mindless, hunger-driven, they turned toward the village, and they began to march. Hasseldorf burns. The first scream came from the old miller's house. A young woman, Alessa, the miller's daughter, had awoken to the sound of scratching outside her window. When she pulled back the shutter, she had barely a moment to see the rotting face staring back at her, its jaw hanging loose, its hollow eyes burning with unnatural hunger, before the creature tore the wooden frame apart. Then the bells rang. The village awoke in terror, the cries of warning barely rising above the wails of the undead. A horde of ghoulish figures, twisted remnants of former villages, forgotten travelers, and nameless dead, shambled through the streets, clawing at doors, dragging the living from their homes. Men and women tried to flee, but where could they go? The dead outnumbered them. One by one, houses were breached, the soft glow of candlelight snuffed out in crimson horror. A child screamed as a ghoul ripped into his father, its teeth sinking deep into his throat, tearing away his final breath. A woman fell to her knees, sobbing, only for skeletal hands to seize her hair and drag her into the darkness. Blood pooled in the streets of Hasseldorf, and still the dead kept coming. The witch hunter's response. "Weapons up!" Captain Armand Falk's voice cut through the chaos, a harsh command that rallied his mercenaries to the defense of the village. They had seen the signs, had heard the rumors, but they had not expected this. From the steps of the burning tavern, Falk raised his silver pistol, the rune-carved barrel gleaming under the glow of the rising fires. He took aim at the nearest corpse, a former farmer whose flesh hung in tatters, whose gaping mouth still dripped with the remnants of his last meal. A shot rang out, and the creature's skull burst apart in a spray of black rot and sickly green mist. The beast collapsed, but 5 more lurched forward to take its place. "Hold the line," Falk bellowed, cutting down another with his broadsword. "No one flees. This ends here." His mercenaries fought savagely, hacking through the tide of risen corpses with swords and axes, driving them back with torch and shot, but for every one that fell, 2 more crawled from the earth. Falk's jaw tightened. This wasn't a simple necromantic trick, this was something deeper, something older, something that had been buried too long. And then he understood. His gaze snapped toward Castle Sternholme, its ruined towers barely visible beyond the mist, the old seat of the von Kessel bloodline. The crypt. "Find the von Kessel boy," Falk roared, parrying the grasping claws of a half-rotted soldier. "This is his doing." His men moved at once, cutting their way toward the path leading up to the ruins. The dead had risen, and now Ulrich von Kessel would answer for it. Beneath the crypt, far beneath the battle, in the silent darkness of the tomb, Ulrich stood before the half-unsealed sarcophagus, Dragos' spectral form towering before him. The presence of his awakening master had spread beyond these walls. His power was seeping into the land, reanimating corpses long forgotten, pulling the dead from their rest as his influence grew stronger. The village was already lost. Ulrich clenched his fists, his breath uneven. "What have I done?" Dragos tilted his head, his ember-like gaze piercing through the dark. "You have begun what was always fated to be, my faithful one." A distant explosion shook the crypt, a powder keg detonating in the village, the witch hunters fighting for their lives above. "They come for you now," Dragos said, his voice like a blade scraping against stone. Ulrich knew it was true. He had awakened something he did not yet understand. And now there was no going back. Chapter 10. A Pyre for the Heretic. The world smelled of smoke and blood. Ulrich von Kessel's wrists burned where the iron shackles bit into his flesh, his shoulders aching from the rough hands that had dragged him through the village. The bodies of the dead, some human, some no longer recognizably so, lay in heaps along the muddy road. The fires still raged in Hasseldorf, consuming homes and corpses alike, casting long, flickering shadows across the town square. The survivors had been gathered here, trembling beneath the steely gaze of witch hunter Captain Armand Falk, their faces lined with fear and exhaustion. And Ulrich knelt before the pyre. Judgment of fire. "Ulrich von Kessel, you are accused of heresy, necromancy, and consorting with the undead." Falk's voice rang across the square, clear and unyielding, echoing with the authority of Sigmar's Templars. His coat was torn, his sword still stained with the black ichor of the risen dead, but his conviction had not wavered. Ulrich lifted his gaze, meeting the witch hunter's eyes without flinching. "You think this was my doing?" His voice was hoarse, but steady. "You saw the bodies, Falk. This was something older, something stronger than I ever could be." Falk did not blink. "The dead do not rise without cause." He turned to the gathered villagers, their faces gaunt with fear, their lips pressed into silent prayers. 8 exercise. This man has walked among you, hidden in the ruins of Sternholme, tending the crypts of the damned. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. "All did not burn when the corpses came for us," one voice whispered. "Was always in the graveyard," another spat. Thomas Reichland, his betrayer, stood at the front, his face pale, his hands shaking. "I told you he was hiding something." Ulrich's jaw tightened. "I was keeping something buried." But the truth did not matter. Falk's expression remained cold. He raised a hand, signaling to the mercenaries at his flank. "Bind him to the pyre." The crowd shifted as Ulrich was hauled to his feet, the mercenaries tying him to the wooden post, their faces a mix of duty and discomfort. The pyre had been stacked hastily, dry wood, oil-soaked rags, the scent of tallow thick in the air. Falk stepped forward, drawing a torch from one of his men, the flame flickering in the cold night air. "May Sigmar's light cleanse your soul, von Kessel." Ulrich closed his eyes, feeling the heat approach, knowing this was the end. But the crypt had not been silent, and the dead had not finished speaking. The shadow at the gallows. The first scream came from the watchmen stationed on the rooftops. A blur of movement, something inhuman, something fast, a shadow leaping from the smoke, landing atop the wooden gallows with a bone-snapping crunch. The mercenary had no time to react before the clawed hand crushed his throat, dragging him into the darkness. Then the real slaughter began. A figure dropped into the square, its cloak billowing, its face hidden beneath a mask of carved bone. It moved like a wraith, cutting through Falk's men with terrifying precision, talons ripping through armor and flesh like parchment. A mercenary raised his pistol only for the stranger to cross the space in a blink, gripping his wrist and twisting it until the bone snapped through his skin. Another lunged with a silver stake, but the masked warrior caught him mid-strike, lifted him effortlessly, and hurled him into the burning pyre. The screams filled the air. Ulrich stared in shock as the figure cut through the witch-hunters like wheat before a scythe. Even Falk recoiled, stepping back, his sword raised, his stance shifting from executioner to hunted. "Stand your ground," Falk roared, but his voice carried doubt. The masked figure finally turned toward Ulrich, its movements smooth, predatory, like a beast stalking prey that had already been caught. Then it spoke. "The Pale King will not burn tonight." The voice was low, ancient, touched with the rasp of the grave. Ulrich's breath caught in his throat. He knew what this was. Strigoi. But not just any. This was a ghoul king, a warrior of Dragos's lost court, one of his last faithful servants, hidden in the shadows for centuries, awaiting his master's return. And now it had come to deliver him. The mercenaries hesitated, their superstition warring with their orders. They had fought ghouls, vampires, horrors of the night before. But this thing was different. It was not a mindless beast. It was a predator. And it had chosen a side. Falk's hand tightened on his blade, his eyes narrowing. The vampire. The masked figure tilted its head slightly. "Gancher." Then it lunged. Falk met the charge head-on, his broadsword swinging in a wide arc, but the Strigoi was too fast, dodging the strike with unnatural ease, its clawed hands slashing forward, forcing Falk onto the defensive. The remaining mercenaries broke ranks, some charging in desperation, others turning to flee. The Strigoi did not allow either. It moved through them like a storm, tearing through armor, ripping throats, snapping limbs. Each strike deliberate, each kill absolute. Ulrich felt the ropes loosen, the heat of the fire still licking at his skin, but his mind was already racing. This was Dragos's will. This was his master's hand moving once more. He had wanted a choice, but perhaps the choice had already been made for him. The Strigoi turned to him, its fangs gleaming beneath its bone mask. "Come, von Kessel. Your place is no longer among the living." Ulrich looked at the burning village, at the witch hunters dying in the dirt, at the blood-stained sky, and for the first time he did not resist. He stepped into the night. Chapter 11. The Hidden War. Ulrich von Kessel rode through the ruins of Sylvania, flanked by death on all sides. The masked Strigoi, his silent savior, moved beside him, sometimes in the trees, sometimes upon the broken road, always watching, always waiting. Ulrich should have felt fear. He didn't. Not anymore. Something within him had changed since the night of the pyre. He had spent his whole life guarding the crypt, believing his purpose was to keep the dead from waking. Now he knew the truth. Dragos the Pale was meant to rise, but not all would see it as destiny. As the ruined towers of Castle Sternholme came into view, his new reality became clear. The living were not the only ones who had taken interest in the tomb. The war beneath the grave. Ulrich followed the Strigoi through a hidden passage, deeper into the forgotten halls of Sternholme's crypt. The air was thick with death, but not the still silence of the grave. This was something else, something moving. It was a battlefield waiting to ignite. His guide, still masked, led him through crumbling tunnels, past engraved coffins of long-dead lords, until they reached a hidden chamber deep beneath the castle. And there Ulrich saw them, the factions, each one gathered in opposing silence, watching, waiting, weighing their enemies. Ulrich had never seen their kind before, but he knew them. The first to arrive, the necromancers of Nagash. To the left of the chamber, draped in black robes, surrounded by corpse thralls and bone constructs, stood the cult of Nagash. Their leader, a gaunt figure wrapped in tattered funereal silk, stared at Ulrich with glowing pinpricks of green fire where his eyes should have been. Nagash's disciples, worshippers of the supreme lord of Undead, those who sought to claim Dragos, not as a king, but as a pawn in their ever-growing war against the living and the unfaithful dead alike. "The Pale King stirs," the necromancer rasped. "Nagash wills it. He belongs to us." Ulrich felt his blood turn cold. They did not want Dragos restored. They wanted him enslaved. The second, the blood dragons. Across from them, standing tall in blood-red armor, hands resting upon great Zweihanders, were the knights of the Blood Dragon Order. The warrior vampires stood in rigid discipline, their armor bearing the marks of ancient lineages, their eyes burning with righteous purpose. Their leader, a towering figure with a mane of silver hair, his face set like a sculpted monument of war, stepped forward. "The Strigoi are filth," he said, his voice like the ringing of a blade against steel. "Dragos will not be allowed to return. His kind are a disgrace to the blood. The blood dragons will see to it that his tomb remains sealed forever." Ulrich exhaled slowly. The necromancers sought control. The knights sought destruction. And then there were the others, the last remnants of the Strigoi court. Ulrich turned toward the third group, his group, though he did not yet know what that truly meant. The Strigoi were not knights. They were not scholars of death. They were monsters. Once they had been kings, lords of ancient vampiric houses, but they had been betrayed, hunted, driven into the filth and the dark by the von Karsteins, the Lamians, and the blood dragons alike. Now, those few who remained were starved things, creatures of ruin and vengeance, bound not by politics but by the hunger to reclaim what had been stolen from them. And at their head was Ulrich's masked rescuer, his true identity still hidden beneath bone and shadow. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. Dragos belongs to his own. The hidden war revealed. Ulrich stepped forward. For the first time in his life, he was not just a crypt keeper. He was the last von Kessel, the last of Dragos' sworn line, and they were all waiting for his answer. Would he let Dragos be bound in chains by Nagash's followers? Would he let the blood dragons drive their blades through his master's heart before he could even rise? Or would he stand with the exiled monsters, the forgotten, the hunted, the hated, and see Dragos restored to his throne? The chamber fell silent. The war was about to begin, and Ulrich von Kessel had to choose a side. Chapter 12. The Call of the Master. The Chamber of the Dead had fallen into silence. The factions stood waiting, their hungry gazes locked on Ulrich von Kessel, the last crypt keeper, the final heir to a forgotten duty that had spiraled far beyond his understanding. The blood dragons gripped their swords, ready to strike down any who sought to free Dragos. The necromancers of Nagash clutched their staffs, eager to ensnare the Pale King's spirit before it could fully wake. And the Strigoi, monstrous and twisted, loomed in the darkness, their eyes smoldering with the vengeance of the Forsaken. Ulrich's heart pounded, his body still aching from the wounds of the past nights, the betrayal, the fire, the horrors that had followed him from Hasseldorf. But the thing that had changed the most was not his body, nor his mind. It was his purpose, because now, for the first time, he could hear his master's voice. It whispered to him from the void between worlds, a fragmented, splintered thing, as if Dragos' soul had been trapped in the very iron of his own sarcophagus, bleeding through the cracks of his prison. Blood of my blood, you stand at the threshold. Ulrich felt his knees nearly buckle. The presence was overwhelming, a force older than any of them, older than Sylvania itself. Dragos was not fully awake, not yet. His mind was fractured, his soul still anchored to the chains that had bound him for centuries. But he was reaching out, and he had chosen Ulrich. The final rite must be given, the binding must be complete. Ulrich's fingers curled into fists. "What must I do?" he whispered. The moment he spoke, the glyphs upon the walls of the chamber began to glow, the old runes of Dragos' crypt humming with power. The blood dragons drew their blades, sensing the shift in the air. "Ritwa is performing a ritual," one of them hissed. "Stop him." The Strigoi snarled, moving to intercept, but Ulrich was already falling into the trance, his mind pulled deeper into the master's will. The glyphs were revealing themselves to him. Lines of power, ancient sigils that had been carved into the very stone of Sternholme when Dragos was first bound. Runes meant to keep him from waking. But now they could be rewritten. Ulrich moved forward, stepping toward the massive sarcophagus, dragging his hand across the surface, smearing the dust and time away until the sigils were fully visible. He understood them now. His family had never been wardens. They had been acolytes, servants awaiting the day of resurrection. And now it had come. "Swear to me." The voice rasped from the ether, heavy as a king's crown, light as an oath whispered in blood. "Swear, and I shall awaken." Ulrich pressed his hand against the stone and spoke the words that had been buried for centuries. "I am the last of von Kessel." The glyphs flared. "I am bound to the master's will." The air trembled. "I give myself to the Pale King." The symbols ignited, and for the first time in centuries, the chains upon Dragos' coffin shattered into dust. A pulse of darkness exploded outward, throwing the factions into chaos. The necromancers screamed as the raw power of a true vampire lord burned through their magic, disrupting their hold upon the dead. The blood dragons staggered back, raising their blades in alarm as the very walls of Sternholme groaned and cracked, the stones remembering who they once belonged to. The Strigoi knelt, their monstrous heads bowed in reverence, waiting for their king. And Ulrich? Ulrich fell forward, collapsing to his knees, feeling something cold, ancient, and eternal pour into his veins. He was no longer just a man. He was Dragos's will made flesh, and soon the Pale King himself would follow. Chapter 13. Sylvania Burns. The sky over Castle Sternholme burned with an unnatural glow, the color of dying embers and rotting wounds, as the land itself trembled beneath the weight of old power waking once more. The witch hunters had come, and they were not alone. The hunters' charge. The banners of Sigmar snapped in the wind as the witch hunters of the Empire, clad in blackened leathers and steel, marched upon the ruins of Sternholme. Their ranks were filled with mercenaries, Templars, and Inquisitors, men who had spent their lives slaughtering monsters and purging the taint of the undead. At their head, Captain Armand Falk rode forward, his coat torn from battle, his face set in grim determination. No more shadows, no more whispers. He raised his sword, the sigil of the twin-tailed comet gleaming in the torchlight. This night Sternholme falls. A roar erupted from his men, and with it the Empire's fire and steel came crashing upon the gates of the ruined castle. Cannon fire thundered, sending ancient stone crumbling. Silver-tipped bolts and holy wards were raised high, their presence a defiance against the ancient horrors that lurked within. The witch hunters thought they had come to fight a den of monsters. They had no idea what waited for them in the dark. A war on 3 fronts. The moment the Empire's attack began, the hidden war inside the ruins erupted. The cult of Nagash had not come to negotiate. They had waited long enough. Their leader, High Necromancer Voskar the Withered, raised a staff of bone, his lips moving in a chant older than any living empire. Rise, O silent ones, rise and serve the will of the great necromancer. The earth split apart, and skeletal warriors, clad in rusted armor, clawed their way free. Rotting wights pulled themselves from their graves, their souls bound to their master's will, their blades raised to carve through any who opposed them. Their target? Not the hunters. Not yet. The blood dragons. Across the chamber, the red-clad knights, towering figures of steel and war, raised their Zweihanders, standing in unyielding defiance. Their leader, Sir Ulrich von Kessel, bared his fangs, his voice a booming echo of centuries past. Nagash's filth will not claim this place. To arms, warriors! We end this heresy with steel. With a battle cry that shook the halls, the knights charged. Blade met spell, steel met bone, and the crypt of Dragos became a slaughterhouse of undeath. The Strigoi unleashed. The masked Strigoi, silent until now, let out a piercing shriek, an inhuman sound that shattered the stalemate of battle. From the shadows they came, ghouls, clawed horrors, and the exiled vampires of Dragos's ruined court, hurling themselves into the fray. Where the blood dragons fought like warriors, and the necromancers wove their magic, the Strigoi ripped and tore, bodies moving with unnatural speed, their talons carving through the dead and the living alike. One of Falk's hunters barely had time to turn before his throat was torn away, his lifeblood painting the ground in sacrament to the rising king. The battle had become chaos incarnate. Ulrich's choice. Ulrich stood upon a crumbling balcony, overlooking the madness below, his heart pounding with the weight of everything that had led him here. He had been raised to guard the tomb, to ensure it remained undisturbed. But now he had broken that oath. Now he stood between monsters. The hunters, with their fanatic righteousness, had come to burn all that they did not understand. The necromancers, with their insatiable hunger for control, would see Dragos shackled to their god. The blood dragons, noble in their own twisted way, would rather see Sylvania itself burn before allowing a Strigoi king to rise again. And the Strigoi? They were here to serve Dragos, and so was he. The voice in his mind was no longer distant whispers. It was clear now, commanding, no longer fractured by centuries of slumber. Ulrich. He turned, his eyes locking on the black sarcophagus, now free of chains and bindings, its surface pulsing with cold, unholy power. "Come to me." The castle shuddered, as if it too recognized what was happening. The master was waking. Ulrich stepped forward, and below him, Sylvania burned. Chapter 14. The Deathless Reign. The sarcophagus of Dragos the Pale stood at the heart of the crypt, its once rusted metal now humming with unholy energy, the glyphs carved upon its surface pulsing like a second heartbeat. The air was thick with the weight of ancient power, pressing down on Ulrich von Kessel as he stepped closer, his mind adrift between fate and fear. Below, the ruins of Castle Sternholme were bathed in blood and fire, the battle between witch hunters, necromancers, and rival vampires waging on. But here, in the deepest part of the crypt, none of it mattered. Only Dragos mattered. The king's awakening. Ulrich placed a trembling hand upon the sarcophagus, feeling the cold pulse beneath his fingers, the sensation of something stirring inside. He could hear the master's thoughts now, no longer fragmented whispers, but a voice of command, deep as the grave itself. "The seal is undone, the chains are broken, but I am still weak." The stone lid shuddered, cracks splintering across its surface as black mist curled from within. A shape shifted inside, slow and unsteady, as if dragging itself back from the abyss of death. Through the fog of his mind, Ulrich knew what was missing. Dragos was rising, but he was not whole. Not yet. The ritual must be completed, and that meant blood. Not just any blood, a pure soul, untainted by corruption, untouched by undeath. A life freely given, or unwillingly taken. The choice. Ulrich's hands curled into fists, his breath shallow and ragged. He had known, deep down, he had always known, that his master's return would demand a final sacrifice. His ancestors had been acolytes, not jailers. The von Kessel bloodline had survived not to keep Dragos buried, but to one day restore him. And now he was the last, the one who must see it done. But could he? Could he cut down an innocent in the name of an undead king? He had always believed he was merely a watcher, a guardian, but now he stood at the precipice of something greater, something darker. The Strigoi would have done it without hesitation. The necromancers would have bled entire villages for the same power, but Ulrich was still a man. Wasn't he? The soul must be given. Dragos's voice coiled around his thoughts, wrapping them in cold inevitability. I cannot rise without it. The stone lid slid further, revealing the figure within. Dragos was no longer just a shade. His body was beginning to take shape, his gaunt frame rebuilding itself from mist and shadow, sinew stitching itself across withered bone, veins twisting like roots through dead flesh. His eyes, two glowing embers set deep into a hollow face, locked onto Ulrich. Waiting. The crypt was silent. And then, a sound from the stairs above. A muffled cry. Ulrich turned sharply, his heart hammering as two figures stumbled into the chamber. A young woman, dragged by a witch hunter, her wrists bound, her face streaked with dirt and fear. It was Alessa Rakeland, Tomas's sister, the millwright's daughter, one of the few who had been spared the slaughter in Hasseldorf. Found this one hiding, the hunter sneered, shoving her forward, unaware of the ritual he had just stepped into. She might know something. He didn't finish. The moment he crossed the threshold, a force unseen hurled him backward, his body snapping like a twig as it slammed into the stone wall. His corpse slid to the ground, unmoving. Ulrich barely noticed. He was staring at Alessa, her wide, terrified eyes, her shaking frame, her hands still tied in rough rope. She should not be here. She was innocent. And yet, she was exactly what Dragos needed. A pure soul. A sacrifice. Ulrich's breath came fast and uneven. "Do not hesitate," Dragos whispered. "Take the blade. End her life. Give me what I am owed." Ulrich's hands trembled, his fingers closing around the ritual dagger hanging at his side. The blade was cold, the iron dark with centuries of slumbering purpose. Alessa stared at him, her breath shallow, panicked. Ulrich? She had known him since they were children. She had once bandaged his wounds when he fell from a horse. She had once laughed with him under the old oaks in the village square. Now she stood before him, waiting for a death she did not understand. A sacrifice for the king in the tomb. Ulrich's grip tightened on the dagger. The air grew thick with Dragos's will, the presence of something vast and eternal pressing against his very soul. "Choose, my faithful one," Dragos rasped. Alessa saw the blade in his hands. Tears filled her eyes. "Ulrich, please." The crypt waited. And Ulrich stood at the edge of his own humanity, knowing that the next moment would define him forever. Would he complete the ritual? Would he damn himself to the will of a king long forgotten? Or would he turn against the master he had sworn to serve? His fingers curled around the dagger. And then he made his choice. Chapter 15. The Witch Hunter's Gambit. The crypt shuddered, the very walls groaning under the weight of ancient power. Dragos the Pale sarcophagus stood open, and inside, the undead king stirred, his body slowly weaving itself back together, muscle knitting over ancient bone, flesh regrowing across withered sinew. The final stage of resurrection was at hand, but outside the tomb a different storm raged, and at its center stood Captain Armand Falk. The trap is set. Falk's face was lined with exhaustion, his once pristine coat now torn and blood-stained from the battle raging above. His mercenaries lay dead across the ruined halls of Castle Sternholme, torn apart by the Strigoi, the necromancers, and the damned creatures that called this place home. But Falk had not come for victory. He had come for destruction. The last barrels of black powder had been rolled into position, hidden beneath the rotting floorboards and crumbling pillars of the castle's foundation. A single spark would bring it all down, and if it meant dying here, in this place of damnation and shadow, then so be it. "Signor, give me strength," Falk muttered, striking a match against his gauntlet. The flame flickered in his eyes as he stared down into the depths of the tomb. The crypt had been tainted beyond salvation. There was only one way to end this. He would bury the vampire king and his disciples beneath a mountain of stone and fire, and he would burn Ulrich von Kessel with them. The final confrontation. Ulrich felt it before he saw him, the rising heat, the scent of burning oil, the unmistakable presence of pure hatred. He turned from the altar, his fingers still wet with Alessa's blood. Though he had made his choice, he had not killed her. And in the entrance to the tomb, silhouetted by the firelight of his own madness, stood Captain Armand Falk. The witch hunter's breath came ragged, his eyes filled with something beyond fury, beyond duty. It was zealotry, absolute and unrelenting. "Step away from the corpse, von Kessel." Ulrich's heart pounded. "You don't understand." "I understand enough." Falk took a slow, deliberate step forward, his broadsword glinting with silver light, the runes of Sigmari purity seared into the blade's surface. "I saw you kneel before it. I saw you spill blood in its name." Ulrich lifted his dagger, but it felt small and meaningless against the weight of Falk's conviction. "This place will fall," Falk continued. "I will collapse the crypt, I will burn everything that remains, and I will put you down myself." Ulrich's pulse hammered in his ears. Behind him, the figure in the sarcophagus shifted, a low exhale of breath rolling through the tomb like a winter wind. Dragos was almost whole, and Falk knew it. The hunter lunged. Ulrich barely had time to raise his dagger before the broadsword crashed down, the force of the blow sending him staggering backward. He moved instinctively, dodging left, slashing out, but Falk was faster, stronger, his movements honed by a lifetime of hunting creatures like this. He was going to kill him. And Ulrich realized, for the first time in his life, he was fighting for his own survival. Not for the crypt, not for his family's duty, not even for Dragos, for himself. The duel in the tomb. The clash of steel rang through the chamber as Ulrich and Falk traded blows, their battle illuminated by the flickering torches and the eerie glow of the resurrecting vampire king. Falk fought with absolute precision, his blade cutting through the air in flawless arcs, each strike meant to maim, to cripple, to end. Everything. Ulrich fought like a man who had never been trained for war, but one who had no intention of dying. He ducked, rolling beneath a swing meant to take his head, his dagger slicing across Falk's forearm, drawing a thin line of blood. The witch hunter grunted but did not falter. You were a dead man the moment you sided with this filth. Ulrich blocked the next strike, feeling his bones rattle from the impact. I never had a choice, he spat back, shoving forward, trying to force Falk off balance. The hunter sneered. He always had a choice. With brutal efficiency, Falk slammed the hilt of his sword into Ulrich's gut, sending him crashing to the floor. Ulrich gasped, pain blooming through his ribs. Falk raised his blade, preparing the final blow. The ends now. A hand closed around Falk's wrist. Not Ulrich's. A clawed, pale hand, its grip strong as iron, cold as death itself. Falk's eyes widened. Ulrich looked up, his breath catching in his throat. Dragos had risen. The Pale King stood in full form, his body restored, his long white hair flowing like a funeral shroud, his sunken red eyes burning with something ancient and endless. His thin lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile. You have fought well, hunter. Dector. Falk snarled, trying to wrench himself free, but Dragos was faster. With inhuman grace, the vampire twisted Falk's arm, snapping the bones like dry twigs. The hunter's scream echoed through the crypt. Ulrich could only watch, his heart hammering. You wished to burn my tomb? Dragos mused, lifting Falk effortlessly, holding him above the ground like a doll. How poetic, then, that you shall be the first to burn. A wave of black mist curled from Dragos's fingertips, wrapping around Falk's body like writhing tendrils of shadow and hunger. The hunter gritted his teeth, refusing to scream again. Finish it, vampire. Dragos's smile widened, and he tossed Falk aside like discarded prey, sending him crashing into the crypt wall with enough force to shatter stone. The witch hunter collapsed, blood spilling from his mouth. He was still alive. Barely. Dragos turned to Ulrich, his piercing red gaze locking onto his acolyte. You have done well, von Kessel. The vampire stepped down from his sarcophagus, standing at his full height, regal and terrible to behold. The crypt, once a tomb, had become a throne room once more, and Ulrich knew the deathless reign had begun. Chapter 16. The Return of the Pale King. The air in the crypt was different now, heavier, colder, unnatural. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp around Dragos the Pale, as if the world itself struggled to comprehend his return. Ulrich von Kessel staggered back, his breath ragged as he beheld the master in his full, unholy glory. The Pale King stood tall, his body fully restored, yet still touched by the unnatural gauntness of his kind. His skin was pale as moonlight, stretched taut over an aristocratic face, his deep crimson eyes gleaming like embers in a long-dead fire. His hair, once tangled and matted by time, now flowed in ghostly strands, moving as if caught in an invisible current. He was awake, and the dead knew it. Above them, beyond the crypt, the battle raged on. But something shifted. The blood dragons hesitated, their warrior's instinct recognizing the moment the tide had turned. The necromancers of Nagash faltered, their own magic snuffed out by the presence of something far greater than themselves. The Strigoi let out a keening wail, one of pure reverence, their twisted forms bowing low in the shadow of their king. And in the distance, the dead answered. The bodies of the slain, scattered throughout the ruined halls of Sternholme and beyond, twitched, their empty husks suddenly filled with the Pale King's will. A ripple of dark energy rolled across the land, a silent command, felt not just in the crypt but across Sylvania itself. And the dead obeyed. The test of loyalty. Ulrich could feel the weight of Dragos's gaze settle upon him. "You have done well, von Kessel." The voice was silken and rich, yet beneath it lurked something deeper, something ancient, like a grave whispering through the ages. Ulrich swallowed hard. His master had risen, but at what cost? Was he still himself? Or had he become something else entirely? Dragos took a slow step forward, his movement almost effortless, the air around him distorting as though he were barely tethered to this world. "But now, my faithful one, I must know where your heart truly lies." Ulrich stiffened, his muscles instinctively tensing. He had bound himself to Dragos's will, spoken the words of resurrection, spilled the necessary blood, but something in the vampire's gaze told him that was not enough. Dragos lifted one hand, and in an instant a form was dragged forward by unseen hands. Alessa Reichland. She had tried to flee in the chaos. Now she knelt before Dragos, her body trembling, her arms pinned by invisible force, her terrified eyes locked onto Ulrich. "A pure soul remains," Dragos murmured. Ulrich felt his heart stop. "She was meant for the ritual, yet you chose to spare her." The words dripped with curiosity, but there was an edge beneath them, a test of something far greater than loyalty. Ulrich's hands clenched into fists, his throat dry as ash. His mind raced. How could he explain? That she had been innocent, that he had known her since childhood, that for all his ties to Dragos, for all the darkness he had accepted, he could not bring himself to cut down a girl who had never known true sin? His silence stretched too long. Dragos exhaled softly, tilting his head slightly, his expression one of quiet amusement or disappointment. "You hesitate." The pressure in the air increased, the weight of Dragos's power pressing against Ulrich's very soul. A small smile played across the vampire lord's lips, but his eyes burned with command. "Then you must make your choice now." He extended a clawed hand, gesturing toward Alessa's trembling form. "Kill her, von Kessel. Prove your devotion." A line in the sand. The words struck like a hammer. Ulrich felt the dagger still strapped to his belt, the cold weight of it pressing against his side. One motion, one cut, one moment of absolute submission, and he would truly belong to Dragos's court. He would become more than a crypt keeper. He would become a disciple of the undead, a servant of the Pale King, eternally bound in blood and shadow. His hand twitched. Alessa's breath hitched in her throat. Ulrich saw the flickering torchlight in her wide, terrified eyes, the silent plea for mercy that she did not dare speak aloud. For a moment the crypt was silent. Then Ulrich exhaled, and he let the dagger fall. The word was soft, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. Dragos's expression did not change, but the room itself seemed to darken. The flames flickered, the shadows stretched. The vampire's gaze hardened, the amusement fading from his lips. "No." Ulrich lifted his chin, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I have spilled blood for you, my lord. I have resurrected you. I have fulfilled my family's duty." He took a slow step forward, his heart pounding, yet his conviction unchanging. "But I will not be your butcher." The crypt shuddered, the ancient walls groaning beneath Dragos's displeasure. The vampire lord regarded him in silence, the weight of his judgment absolute. The Strigoi flinched, the necromancers whispered, the very dead hesitated. And then Dragos smiled, a slow, knowing, deadly smile. Interesting. The pressure eased, and with a flick of his wrist, Alessa was released, falling to the ground, gasping for breath. Ulrich did not move to help her. His eyes remained locked on his master. Dragos turned away, stepping toward the ruined remains of his sarcophagus, his arms spreading wide, taking in the battle still raging outside. "Very well, von Kessel." His voice was softer now, almost pleased. "Perhaps you will be more useful to me with your convictions intact." He exhaled, his breath carrying the stench of centuries lost. "We have wasted enough time." He turned, his red eyes flashing like a dying sun. Sylvania must remember its king. Ulrich knew what was coming. Dragos would not remain in this crypt. He would take back his kingdom. He would march upon the empire. And now, Ulrich was bound to his war, no matter what choice he had made. Chapter 17. A New Master. The crypt's oppressive silence had shattered. Dragos the Pale stood at his full height, the long-dead king reborn, his form still bearing the marks of time's cruelty, his flesh too pale, his veins black with necrotic power, his crimson eyes like smoldering coals in a frozen skull. Ulrich felt the weight of it, the sheer presence of his master in the world once more. It filled the crypt like a storm before the downpour, thick with dark majesty and an unholy promise. But it was not the Pale King's power that Ulrich feared. It was the price he had yet to pay, the gift of undeath. Nearly. Dragos's command was not spoken, it was felt. A compulsion so absolute, so unrelenting, that Ulrich's body obeyed before his mind had even comprehended it. His knees struck the stone floor, the sound barely registering against the roar of battle above. The remaining witch hunters fought desperately to hold the castle ruins, but they would soon fall. The Strigoi had risen, and their master called them home. Dragos stepped forward, standing over Ulrich like a god over a broken worshipper. "You have served well, von Kessel." His long fingers reached out, curling under Ulrich's chin, forcing him to look upon his king. But a servant cannot stand beside his master as a man. Ulrich knew what was coming. He had seen it in his nightmares, the taking of the soul, the hollowing of what it meant to be human, the cold eternity of hunger. But now it was real. "Your blood has bound you to me, Ulrich. You awakened me. You called me forth, and now you shall become more than you ever were." Ulrich wanted to protest, wanted to say no, wanted to resist, but he couldn't. He had already chosen his path. Dragos lowered his head, his breath cold as a crypt wind, and then thanks. A searing pierce at his throat, a pain so sharp it was almost euphoric. His vision swam, his pulse quickened, the sensation unlike any wound he had suffered before. This was not death. This was something worse. He felt his life unraveling, his blood drawn away, his soul siphoned into the endless hunger of his master. Darkness coiled in his veins, a spreading, parasitic cold that devoured all warmth, all light. And then a moment of emptiness. A single second where he felt nothing. No heartbeat, no breath. Only void. Then, the hunger came. Ulrich's eyes snapped open, the world warping before him, his senses overwhelming. He could hear the dying cries of the witch hunters outside, smell the blood of the wounded, feel the pulse of the battle even from the crypt's depths. His muscles tensed, his nails had blackened into claws, his very skin was colder, stronger, unnatural. He gasped, his body rejecting the change even as it embraced it. "Rise, my knight," Dragos whispered. Ulrich rose, but he was no longer Ulrich von Kessel, crypt keeper of Sternholme. He was Ulrich, deathless servant of the Pale King. The fall of the witch hunters. Above them, in the ruined courtyard of Castle Sternholme, Captain Armand Falk lay broken, his ribs shattered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His men were dying around him, their last stand turning into a massacre. The Strigoi horde had been unleashed. They had crawled from the crypts, risen from the bones of the castle itself, and now they feasted. The sky burned red from the fires of war, yet the darkness of the undead swarmed over it, blotting out the last vestiges of light. The hunters had fought bravely, but they had never stood a chance. The first wave had been ghouls, mindless and feral, tearing through the mercenaries with claws and fangs. The second wave had been the exiled vampires, the last remnants of Dragos's shattered court, re-emerging from their hiding places in the deep forests of Sylvania. And now the third wave was here, led by Ulrich himself. The former crypt keeper emerged from the ruined keep, stepping into the chaos, his senses overwhelmed by the scent of blood, the fear in the air, the warmth of bodies waiting to be silenced. His first battle as one of them, and he hungered. The witch hunters saw him, but they did not recognize him at first. To them, he was just another monster in the endless tide of the dead. Then Falk's eyes locked onto his, and for a single flickering second, Ulrich saw recognition. "How?" Falk breathed, realization settling in. Ulrich smiled, and in that moment Falk understood the true horror of it. It was not Dragos who would end him. It was the man he had once tried to save. The man who had once been human. With inhuman speed, Ulrich moved, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye, his claws slashing through Falk's armor, sending blood spraying across the ruins. The hunter gasped, staggering, trying to lift his blade, but Ulrich grabbed him by the throat, lifting him effortlessly from the ground. "You burned my home." Ulrich's voice was lower now, richer, filled with something deeper than human breath. "You would have burned me." Falk spat blood in his face. "Should have." Ulrich's smile did not waver. "Yes, you should have." And with that he sank his fangs into Falk's throat, drinking deep of the last righteous man of Sternholme. The witch hunter's body convulsed, the life draining from him like sand slipping through a broken hourglass. When Ulrich dropped him, he was nothing but a husk, his lifeblood now fueling the creature he had sworn to destroy. The last of the witch hunters had fallen, and the Pale King had won, the beginning of the end. As Ulrich wiped the blood from his lips, he turned toward his master. Dragos stood atop the ruined battlements, his cloak of darkness billowing, his gaze cast toward the horizon beyond Sylvania. "We are not yet finished, my knight," Dragos murmured. His eyes glowed brighter, his arms spread wide, and from the depths of the castle, a new sound arose. A chorus of whispers, a tide of shadows, the sound of something far greater waking from its slumber. Dragos was not merely a king reborn. He was a storm given form, and soon the empire itself would tremble, for the Pale King had returned. Chapter 18. The Fall of Sternholme. The night stretched unnaturally long over Sylvania, as if the darkness itself had deepened in anticipation of what was to come. The ruins of Castle Sternholme, once a forgotten relic of an older age, now pulsed with necromantic energy, its shattered battlements and crumbling halls shifting as though the castle itself were alive again. Dragos the Pale stood atop the highest ruin, his newly restored form clad in flowing black silks, his ashen hair trailing behind him like a spectre's veil, his red eyes burning with cruel satisfaction. He had waited centuries for this moment, and now Sylvania trembled beneath his return. The Pale King's call. The echoes of war still lingered in the air, the screams of the dying, the scent of burning flesh, the torn remnants of witch-hunter banners left to rot in the mud. The once proud crusaders of the Empire had come to purge Sternholme. Instead, they had been devoured, and now only the undead remained. The Strigoi horde, twisted and monstrous, gathered beneath their master, bowing low, their hideous forms quivering in reverence. They had waited in the dark, in the crypts and ruins, feeding on scraps, shunned and forsaken by the other vampire bloodlines. But now their king had returned, and the world would fear them once more. Dragos lifted a single hand, and a wave of unnatural silence fell over the battlefield. The very air hummed with command, and from the depths of Sylvania's ancient graves, more of the dead stirred. The rival bloodlines gather. Not all who watched from the darkness had come to kneel. Some had come to challenge. The blood dragons, noble in their warlike traditions, stood at the edge of the ruins, their crimson armor streaked with the blood of the fallen, their Zweihunters held tight in disciplined stances. Their leader, Sir Ulrich von Kessel, stepped forward, his gaze locked onto Dragos with a mixture of hatred and awe. "You should have remained buried, Strigoi," Ulrich said, his voice low, sharp as the steel of his blade. "You are an abomination to our kind." Dragos laughed, a deep and resonant sound, both regal and terrible. "And yet you came, little knight. You came to see if the stories were true." Ulrich's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. He had come not only to see Dragos return, but to determine if he should be slain before his power could grow. The necromancers of Nagash's cult had also gathered on the battlefield's fringes, their forms draped in tattered robes, their staffs of blackened bone clutched tightly, eyes glowing with ghastly green fire. "You have returned," one of them intoned, their voice a whisper of death and decay. "But you do not rise alone, Dragos the Pale. You rise as one of us, a servant of the great necromancer." Ulrich, standing at Dragos' side, felt the weight of the challenge in the air. These factions did not come to welcome a king. They had come to test him, to see if he was worthy, or to destroy him if he was not. The judgment of the dead. Dragos extended his arms as if to welcome them all, his power coiling around him like a living shadow. "You who have watched from the darkness," his voice carried across the ruined battlefield, neither shouted nor whispered, yet heard by all who stood before him. "You who have doubted, who have whispered that I was but a myth, a name lost to time." He stepped forward, his presence warping the air, the very ground beneath him cracking with necrotic force. "Kneel now and serve me." His eyes turned toward the blood dragons, and then to the cult of Nagash. "Or perish where you stand." The challenge was set. A moment of absolute silence followed, the gathered vampires, necromancers, and undead warlords weighing their next move. And then Ulrich raised his blade. "For honor, for war, for the true blood." He began, but he never finished. Dragos moved faster than thought, faster than breath. One moment he stood before his throne, the next he was at Ulrich's throat, his clawed hand wrapped around the knight's head. The blood dragon barely had time to gasp before Dragos wrenched his head from his shoulders, his body collapsing in a heap of crimson steel. The other knights faltered. Their leader, a warrior who had never known fear, had just been ended in a single stroke. Dragos lifted the severed head, blood dripping from his claws. "The war is over." One by one, the blood dragons lowered their swords, their rigid discipline forcing them to accept the inevitable. They did not kneel, but they did not fight. Dragos turned to the necromancers, his smile cold as a tombstone in winter. "You sought to claim me," he murmured, "to bind me to Nagash's will. You would have put chains upon me." The high necromancer stepped back, true terror flickering in his undead eyes. "Great One." Dragos lifted a hand, and the necromancer's entire body crumbled into dust. The others fell to their knees at once, hands raised in silent submission. "You serve me now," Dragos decreed. "Not Nagash, not von Karstein, not your foolish mortal gods." The cult of Nagash had been broken. The blood dragons had been humbled, and those who would not bow had been destroyed. The war for Sternholme was over. The Pale King had won. The beginning of the reign. As Dragos turned back toward his throne of ruin, Ulrich stood at his side, feeling the weight of what had just been done. Sylvania would no longer belong to the scattered remnants of dead empires. It would no longer be ruled from the shadows. Dragos had proven himself the true king of the undead. And now the world beyond these cursed lands would know his name once more. His reign had just begun. Chapter 19. The Crypt Keeper's Lament. The crypt lay silent once more. Not the silence of death, nor the hush of something forgotten. This was a different silence. The stillness of something too broken to be mended, too changed to return to what once was. Ulrich von Kessel stood before the ruins of the sarcophagus, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. But it was not true breath that passed his lips. He did not need to breathe anymore. He did not need much of anything. Not food, not warmth, not sleep. He had become something else, something less than a man, something more than a corpse. The death of Ulrich von Kessel. His reflection stared back at him from a shattered silver plate, abandoned among the ruins of Castle Sternholme. The man he had once been was gone. His skin had lost its human warmth, now pale and thin, stretched unnaturally over bones that had grown sharper, longer. His fingers ended in blackened claws. His veins ran dark with necrotic ichor. His once brown eyes now burned with dim amber fire, the color of a candle's last flickering light. He had not become a true vampire, not a noble predator, not a mortal lord. No, Dragos had left him something worse. He was not Strigoi, but neither was he fully alive. He was a servant, a ghoulish thrall, bound not by chains, but by the will of his master. And it was too late to turn back. Ulrich clenched his fists, his sharp nails biting into his palms, but no pain came. No pain would ever come again. He was beyond such things now. And yet, deep within the hollow shell of his body, something still mourned. Not for his soul, that had long been lost, but for his name, for the legacy of his family, for the end of the von Kessel line. The Crypt Keeper's duty fulfilled. His ancestors had kept this tomb for centuries, sworn to protect it, sworn to ensure that Dragos would never rise. But they had lied to themselves. Their duty had never been to guard against him, it had been to await his return. And now that day had come. The von Kessels were no more. No one remained to light the candles within the crypt. No one remained to tend the graves of the forgotten. No one remained to carry the name forward. He was the last, and he was no longer even a man. Ulrich bowed his head. "I am sorry." The words were softer than a whisper, spoken not to Dragos, nor to the night, but to the past itself. His father, his grandfather, the long-dead generations that had come before him. They had believed in duty, and duty had swallowed them whole, just as it had swallowed him. The final toll of the bell. A deep, distant toll rang through the castle ruins, its sound warped and strange, as though reality itself was beginning to bend around the will of Dragos the Pale. His master had taken the throne of Sternholme, and soon he would march. Ulrich turned toward the great hall, toward the gathering of the dead. The Strigoi had assembled, the last of Dragos's ancient court standing once more. Their monstrous forms bowed before their risen king. The blood dragons had fallen silent, their leader's corpse still clutched in Dragos' hands, a final lesson to those who would defy him. The necromancers of Nagash's cult had bent the knee, their own willpower crushed beneath Dragos's dominion. The war had ended before it had begun, and Ulrich had no place among them. Not truly. You hesitate, my knight. Dragos' voice drifted through the chamber, smooth as marble, cold as the grave. Ulrich lifted his gaze. His master sat upon a throne of broken stone and bone, the old ruins of his tomb reshaped into a seat of power, his form now whole, his red eyes burning with the wisdom of the centuries lost to him. What troubles you? Ulrich opened his mouth to speak, but what words could he offer? That he mourned the man he once was? That he had never wanted this life? That he had never wished to serve an undead master, to lose his humanity, to stand among those he had once feared? What use was mourning to a creature that had walked beyond death itself? He was bound to Dragos's will now, and he could feel his master's hunger thrumming in the back of his mind, a constant whisper that would never leave him. There is no place for the past in the empire I will carve, Ulrich. Dragos's words were neither cruel nor gentle. They were simply true. You are no longer von Kessel. The crypt keepers are gone. A pause, then a slow, wicked smile. You are mine now. Ulrich lowered his head. His past was gone. His name was gone. His bloodline was gone. He was nothing more than a relic of a forgotten duty, just another corpse in a king's growing army. And the worst part? He no longer knew if he cared. The end of the crypt keepers. Far beyond the ruins of Sternholme, the land of Sylvania lay silent, the forests unnaturally still, the distant villages dark and quiet, as if the very land had stopped breathing. The von Kessels had watched over this crypt for generations, their line stretching back so far that even the oldest books barely spoke their name. Now, the name no longer existed at all. The last crypt keeper had fallen. The last von Kessel had become something else. And with Dragos's return, the dead would no longer sleep. Sylvania would rise, and the world would never be the same again. Chapter 20. The March of the Strigoi. The night sky above Sylvania was wrong. The stars, once distant and indifferent, now shuddered in their places, their light dimmed by an unseen hand. The clouds had turned thick and black, swirling in slow, ominous circles above the ruins of Castle Sternholme. And at the center of it all, Dragos the Pale stood upon his throne, his red eyes burning like funeral pyres, his presence warping the very air around him. His voice, when he spoke, was a death knell upon the wind. The night belongs to us once more. The earth trembled beneath him, and the dead obeyed. The Pale King's army. From the ruined catacombs the first wave emerged. Ghouls, twisted creatures of filth and hunger, crawling over the broken walls, their clawed hands digging through the soil like insects disturbed from a nest. From the forgotten graves the second wave followed, wights clad in rusted armor, their empty sockets flickering with cold green fire, gripping their weapons with fingers long decayed but never truly lifeless. And then came the third wave, the true horror of Dragos's return. The Strigoi vampires, exiled and monstrous, rose from their hiding places, from the cursed woods, the damp crypts. the forgotten ruins of a world that had abandoned them. No longer would they cower in the shadows, feeding like vermin on the edges of the living world. Their king had returned, and they would feast upon the Empire. The Empire's doom approaches. In the distance, beyond the twisted forests of Sylvania, the first towns of the Empire lay in silence, their citizens unaware of the nightmare that had begun its march. The countryside of Stirland, long accustomed to the eerie quiet of their cursed neighbor, did not yet know what was coming. They did not see the thousands of hungry eyes glowing like embers in the dark. They did not hear the whispers of the dead, carried on the cold winds. They did not feel the weight of a forgotten terror, one that had been sealed away for centuries, only to rise once more with the fury of the damned. But soon they would. Soon the Pale King's banner would rise over the fields of men. Soon the bells of the Empire would ring not in warning, but in mourning. Because Dragos was not coming to conquer. He was coming to devour. The deathless servant speaks. At the front of the horde, riding beside the king he had resurrected, Ulrich von Kessel watched the land unfold before them, his vision sharper now, colder, untouched by human weakness. He no longer felt the burden of his past life. The man he had once been, the last crypt keeper, the last of a forgotten duty, was dead. What remained was something else, something eternal. The wind howled through the broken towers of Sternholme, carrying the sound far across the land, across the darkened fields, the silent villages, the doomed cities beyond. And as the Strigoi horde moved forward, Ulrich turned his gaze to the Empire, his lips parting in a whisper. A single phrase, carried by the wind, spoken not in anger nor joy, but in cold, solemn truth. The Pale King has returned, and with him came the end.